Today, we're going to talk about an interesting subject, the non-traditional, non-12 step model that we've developed at Elevate.
The disease model is associated with 12 steps, and that is, addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease. It puts you in this victim mindset, can almost become an excuse, like to fail or to relapse.
You created this condition. You can fix this condition. It doesn't have to define you. We need to see what that trauma is that is underneath this addiction. That's one of the first things that we handle when they come in to Elevate. Clients were just drawn to it. Like, no, I want to talk about this now. No, I need to look at this now. And we found if we didn't let them talk about it or look at it as the first thing, they would have hangups later on in their program.
Yeah, I love it. It's my personal favorite part of our program.
You can't just hyper focus on one area. Like, we're just going to handle the mental aspect if you're not handling the physical aspect. And they're still smoking a ton of cigarettes, eating bad food. Why do I feel like crap? Why would I ever get sober? Well, because you haven't handled the physical aspect. There's all parts of it that need to be, and my expertise, need to be handled with an individual, because addiction hits all of those. So we need to address and fix all those areas to truly send somebody back into the world as a whole and complete and healed individual.
There's so much freedom in that. It's like weight lifted, and you share it with another person, and you're like, oh my gosh, now somebody else knows, and you just feel so amazing when you get through that. By choosing a non-12 step model, you're selecting a path that's built on science, self-responsibility, and holistic health, tangible skills needed for lifelong sobriety. And it's also a very empowering future that awaits you.
Welcome back to the Elevate Experience. Today, we're going to talk about an interesting subject because I hear about it again at every graduation, and I know it's a big differentiator for us as a program compared to the majority of our fellow people out in the field delivering drug and alcohol services. And that's the non-traditional, non-12 step model that we've developed at Elevate. And it's interesting because I would probably say 80% of other drug and alcohol rehabs utilize the AA and NA method. And I'll be the first one to say we are not opposed to this methodology. It's helped tons of people. It's has its place, and a lot of people have experienced a lot of success from it. For us, we have some slight philosophical differences that we want to talk about today as to why a person may choose either a non-traditional, non-12 step program or a program like ours, which utilizes different technology. And the first thing I want to point out, Tom, which is kind of amazing, is that AA and NA has been around for, I think it's 80 years, 90 years. It's been around a long time. And for it to be around that long, obviously there's a lot of good that's come from it. But also we can see that can also be a bit of a hindrance because it hasn't necessarily evolved as a modality to meet people where they're at in today's times.
Yeah, I agree. I personally have tried to get clean and sober in the past, and I really struggled with some of the core philosophies, with the AA-NA 12-step model. I think the big thing is, if you look at these two ideas, there's one, it's the disease model, and then there's another one, the empowerment, or more like a choice style model. And so the big things, the disease model is associated with 12 steps, and that is, addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease. A person, is fundamentally powerless over it. They can't change. And, what that, recovery requires you to surrender to a higher power, and often demands accepting that you are an addict, and that's your label permanently.
Yeah, and for a lot of people that have come to us, this is the big reason as to why they come to us, because to call yourself an addict after you've been sober 20 years, to call yourself an alcoholic when you haven't drank for 10, you're consistently giving yourself a label with a negative connotation saying, I was this when I was a teenager or whenever it was, and I will always be this, no matter how good I do, no matter what I achieve, no matter how far down the road I get. I'm going to consistently put myself back in this box and say, you're just an addict, you're just an alcoholic. And for a lot of people, especially people overcoming addiction, they're kind of rebellious. And so to tell them that you're always going to be this way for the rest of your life, it can be very frustrating and also disempowering, because you're like, so what's the point? If I'm always going to be this way, whether I drink or don't drink, I'm always going to be an alcoholic. For a lot of people, they're like, how can I get on board with that?
Yeah, and it puts you in this victim mindset, like you were saying, where, can almost become an excuse, like to fail or to relapse, like, oh well, I'm just an addict, here I go. I'm having these thoughts, and I guess there's not much I can do because, I'm an addict. The other, so yeah, I spoke a little bit about the disease model, and the other side of the coin is the empowerment or choice model, which is a non-12 step model. And this model looks at the philosophy of addiction is a lot different. It looks at, addiction is viewed as a learned behavior, or, it's a self-destructive coping mechanism that's often rooted in trauma and co-occurring mental health issues. And recovery looks different as well. Recovery requires, self-efficacy and skill acquisition, which could be learning CBT, DBT, and, learning new skills, learning new ways to be rational and manage your choices better.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you brought up, which I often tell people, is, when we're looking at like that victimness of a disease, like this is a self-created disease. This wasn't like you were doing your life and all of a sudden you got cancer. This is self-created. Nobody accidentally becomes an addict. There's actually a lot of work that comes into that, whether it's bad learned habits. I mean, certainly trauma is at the base of almost all addiction. So there's different ways to get it. But when we talk about empowerment, when you're looking at it as I'm just a victim of this disease, it's disempowering, but it also gives you that excuse to not have to be accountable or responsible for your choices, because you can always say, I'm just a victim of this disease. Sorry. But what we do that's different, and what I love and what our clients love about us, is we say, okay, you created this condition. You can fix this condition. This isn't something that needs to be a part of you for the rest of your life. This is something that you did and you used to do, but it doesn't have to define you for this point forward. And people really resonate with that, because when they're given an out, they're going to take it. In fact, one of AA and NA's premises is relapse is part of recovery. That's just a given. And so it's almost like you're giving the person an excuse straight out of the gate to have a relapse, because, hey, sorry, it's just part of the process.
Yeah, and for those individuals that are secular, just the idea of being powerless is just really, yeah, I mean, like you said, it's disempowering, but it just doesn't align, with, the way they feel about the world or life or their own personal beliefs. And, like a more empowerment model, it gives you responsibility back. It gives you self-control back, and you actually feel like you have the potential to change, which is, it's a big flip of viewpoint, and it's kind of it can almost be a play on words, but it really comes down to the way that the program or the philosophy sits with you.
Absolutely. I want to bring up another point here, because I found this fascinating. And this is something I learned almost 20 years ago when I got my initial certification as a drug and alcohol counselor. And so if you go back in time 20 years ago when I was doing this, it might even be 25 years ago, part of the learning back then was that the whole 28-day program was actually built for insurance purposes. So there's no magic number in 28 days. That's just how much insurance would pay back then when this AANA philosophy was created. However, it's now become like this milestone or this cornerstone of you're magically fixed if you go for 28 days. And so it's an incredible fallacy that I think so many people don't understand. And back then, we ourselves were a cash basis. We would bill insurance on a reimbursement, but everything was cash basis. But to find out even way, way, way back then that a program was built and is still as um, gold, that 28 days you're going to be fixed, was all based around what insurance would pay for, is kind of mind blowing that that whole program was built on that one thing, which was insurance payments.
Yeah, once you understand that, it really changes your perspective on those shorter programs. Um, I think an important thing to tackle here is, yeah, like why doesn't the traditional model work for everyone? And we kind of outlined the philosophical reasons, but there's a little more to it that I kind of want to bring up, um, and this is a little bit bringing up some stuff we already mentioned, but the spiritual hurdle, right? There individuals that are secular or agnostic or atheists, the core principle of the traditional model of surrendering to a higher power is a immediate and just insurmountable philosophical barrier, right? They just can't overcome that main core point. And if they can't overcome that, they're not gonna take to treatment at all. It could also bring up a identity conflict, right? Like we were saying, like rejecting the idea of being a powerless addict, and not everyone wants to take on that label for their entire life. And, they would rather prefer a model that views substances as a behavior that can be unlearned and managed through, psychological tools, right? And so the resistance is actually pretty widespread. Studies show that about 75% of secular individuals do not participate in AA or NA, due to the religious and spiritual undertones, which is wild.
It's wild, and it totally makes sense. It was definitely a differentiator for me, and we've seen so many people who were raised very strictly a certain type of religion, Catholicism, Mormonism, you name it. They were raised in a very strict religious upbringing. And so the last thing that they want to do as part of their recovery is to go right back into it. And that's why we leave it very open for the individual's interpretation of what their spiritual preference is, but also not force something on them that isn't true for them, because they're just going to resist it and they're not going to want help. And so we kind of lay the foundation for whatever your spirituality is. Good. Lean into that. Maybe rediscover what you once were. We've had so many people who were born and raised in those churches that went away from it with their addiction, but then given the freedom to come back when they got back on the right track, they go back into, I want to go to church every Sunday. I want to go to church with my grandma, or whatever the different things. They'll like find their ways back to it, as long as you're not forcing it on them and telling them this is the only way.
Yeah, because recovery is spiritual, right? You're on this path, you're becoming more self-aware, and to put everything in, maybe a higher power or faith or belief system to pull you out of this state. Sometimes, with our, science has, made lots of advances. We are just, I think we're just more in tune with ourselves, and maybe it just doesn't sit right because you're like, that just doesn't seem like, it seems like there's some other things I can do first. And then you learn some tools, you start taking care of yourself better physically, maybe nutrition, maybe understanding how your mind works more. And then through those steps, that leads you back to religion, actually, because you're starting to feel better. You're starting to have more of this connection with yourself and with other people. And then you start to explore maybe the idea of, what your higher power is, or, wherever you like to go with, those concepts.
And I would add in there that it's also taking action steps, right? Like we can't all just go and pray all our problems away. I mean, prayer definitely helps. I visualize a lot. Those things are all helpful, but there has to be action steps included. And I think a lot of people think, hey, if I just turn it over and pray to God, it's just going to fix all my problems. It's like, Well, no, but that will definitely open the door to self-betterment because now maybe you're not putting up walls or restrictions on you getting better or barriers that you may have had up due to having to get into a specific type of religion. It opens up your willingness to be open to whatever's going to be there, but you also have to continue to take steps forward. And a lot of times that's going backwards and tackling the trauma that happened as a child that created this addiction as a solution to overcoming that trauma, which I would say we've found 99.99% of the time is at the bottom of every addiction is some type of trauma, whether big or small, that using a substance became a solution for handling that trauma.
Yeah, identifying the root cause. And, the thing about trauma is kind of like a buzzword. A lot of people have this misunderstanding of what trauma could be. They think it, has to be this horrific thing that maybe happened to you, but it could be just this terrible conflict in your life, right? You could be going through some sort of identity crisis that could be traumatic. There's so many different ways trauma can affect our lives. It's just in those circumstances, how we process those moments. It could feel absolutely terrible. Whereas, you dealt with the same thing and you were able to just, process it and work through it and carry on with your day. Whereas, maybe another person, deals with those things and it just absolutely floors them. And, they can't overcome, these circumstances. We're all different in many different ways. And, there's life circumstances, there's, certain experiences that, we've had that can make us maybe more tolerable to certain things, whereas somebody maybe has a more sheltered life. And those experience like they get hit with something pretty hard, pretty big, and then that really registers to them as traumatic.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think that this is where this kind of goes unknown is because a lot of people do say, well, there must have been some gigantic trauma that occurred in your life. And a lot of times there is. I mean, there's traumatic stuff. But for a young developing mind or someone going through that, it could be your parents are going through a divorce. It could be your mom had to work late and didn't pick you up from school and you thought you were abandoned. Like trauma is trauma and it stores the same in the body, period. And so I think a lot of people will brush it under the rug as far as this being the bottom of the addiction because they're like, oh, I had good parents, I had a good life. This was not a situation, but they all lie within the body. And that's why it's up to us and why we strongly believe. And it's interesting because we used to have this further along in the program because I was philosophically saying, hey, should we really be confronting trauma as the first thing when they come in and straight out of detox? And we had our mindfulness workbook for addiction, and we would put those parts that we're handling like extreme loss and failure. Oh, we'll deal with that later when they've had some more sober time under their belt. But what we realized is no, that's actually the first thing that we need to handle. We need to talk about and we need to confront and we need to see what that trauma is that is underneath this addiction. And so that's one of the first things that we handle when they come in to Elevate is attacking that. And like I said, we tried to put it later in the program, but the clients were just drawn to it. Like, no, I want to talk about this now. No, I need to look at this now. And we found if we didn't let them talk about it or look at it as the first thing, they would have hangups later on in their program.
Yeah, it's like why wait to address the main problem, right? Um, and that's exactly what we do in treatment at Elevate. We do have some harder hitting assignments that, touch on exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, trauma early on. And yeah, it's always so powerful and very emotional for the clients, that there may be some tears or they may need an additional one-on-one, but it's good to start to unsurface that stuff early. That it gives you more time to work through it. Why, if you're just waiting till the end, then you just don't have enough time to, fully process it and work through it, do some assignments around it. It is a process to, talk about this stuff. And, there's more layers that keep coming off as time, sobriety time accumulates, right? Um, Another subject that I kind of wanted to bring up was just some other models, like peer supported models that are different than 12-step outside of uh, outside of 12, yeah, outside of 12 step and AA. And there's a couple that are, leading secular like mutual groups, like Smart Recovery, Life Ring, Women for Sobriety. And they're comparable in effectiveness to the 12 step programs. And there are actually some like real skill-based outcomes. These models focus on teaching usable skills. Participants in Smart Recovery in a clinical trial actually reported increasing their sober days by 72%. And these groups actually build a vital support over time, and 81% of participants in Smart Recovery specifically reported feeling more connected to others. And Smart Recovery stands for self-management and recovery training, and so that's a different group, that a free support group that our clients, we recommend to our clients. And we also have Smart Recovery groups every Friday in treatment at Elevate Addiction Services. And so it's just an important thing to mention, because support after treatment is really, really necessary. And yeah, if you don't have 12 steps, which is the biggest recovery group, like where should somebody go? Like where can you get that continued support? And so yeah, I definitely have to mention Smart Recovery.
Yeah, we actually even have a lot of graduates that have gone on and got their facilitator training, and they facilitate free SMART meetings back in the towns that they've come from as a way to give back, but also as a way to continue their community and self-support group. And I
Yeah.
want to touch on right here, Tom, and you mentioned this is something that we hear a lot, that is probably our biggest differentiator, is the community within Elevate, and then the community when they leave. So many people will go to different programs, and maybe they go to an AA or NA meeting, they find a sponsor, and then they're pretty much just doing their own thing. Whereas for us, every part of the program has a community aspect. So when they're working out, it's in the gym with the community. When they're having team, which is like our groups, peer support, peer scenarios that they run with one another, that is in a group setting. When they're doing their education, they're all in there together as a group. So there is so much of the community aspect that we infuse into people, because that is probably one of the number one things that people really, and I hear it every single graduation, it's because of this community here, the facilitators, the people that helped us, my one-on-one counselor, but it's the community. So when there's nothing like having a group of people going through this together that helps sort of bond you, but then be there for each other, and then utilizing positive psychology to lift each other up and not tear each other down. So many people are coming from environments where they can't trust the people around them. They feel like everybody's out to get them. They cannot be vulnerable. They can't show emotion. Like there's a very large facade that people have to put on in order to be in active addiction. But here you're able to put down your walls, you're able to trust one another, be there for one another, learn how to have friends again without feeling used, or you're just like this person because of what they can give you. We like literally teach people how to survive back in the world in this whole hopeful new group and surroundings, wherever it is that they're going, whether it's a CrossFit gym, a SMART meeting, or even, back home with their family and friends.
Yeah, that's such an important part of, any recovery program, is connecting with others. Like addiction is such a selfish thing. It is, it's a thing that experience alone, and you hurt others around you, and and that pain really, you push others away. You push others away because you're making mistakes, or you're lying, or you're essentially, you could be like burning people, taking their money, the list goes on and on. And yeah, reestablishing your connection that you have with yourself, and then the connection you have with others, is just paramount in overcoming addiction. And so yeah, being a part of a group. And that, going back to Smart Recovery, something I really like about Smart Recovery is the groups have crosstalk in them. The 12 step program, you have an opportunity to speak. Usually they go through, there's usually a meeting speaker, and then, maybe individuals can, share a little bit about, what they're going through. But it's not this like collaborative effort where you guys in the meeting are, talking back and forth to each other, giving each other, support and advice. And that's a really cool part of Smart Recovery. And it's something that we do in our groups at Elevate as well. They're all like Smart Recovery groups, every single group. There's lots of peer collaboration and support being exchanged constantly. It's not it's structured, but yet there's this ability to support each other during that group time. A couple other uniques I think that are worth mentioning about Elevate. And we've been touching on that we're trauma informed, which we are. We have trauma informed care. We really believe that trauma is the root cause. The holistic side of what we do, we really focus on physical health and emphasizing exercise and nutrition. But something else that I kind of include in the holistic is mindfulness. The
Mm.
mindfulness practice, like learning how to just be with yourself, be with your minds. Like how can you connect with other people if you can't even, be with just yourself, right? I
Yeah.
think that's such a big point.
It is because, you're not always going to have your group with you if you're in a difficult situation. You're not always going to have your sponsor like immediately answering the phone if you're in a difficult situation. What you will always have is yourself and your ability to find your breath, find your center, and get yourself through whatever hard situation there is. Not to say you shouldn't lean on people when you're in a bad spot, because absolutely you should, but you're not always going to have them with you. And so, what we try to do from day one is teach people how to be there for themselves, whatever situation they might be confronted with, how to find their center, find their breath, take some deep breaths, and work through whatever is triggering them until it's no longer triggering them. That way, they don't make a bad choice impulsively that they can't get themselves out of afterwards.
Yeah, just that understanding that, yeah, this may be uncomfortable. This may feel like it's unbearable, but that it's going to have an end. Like everything has an end. Everything has a beginning and end. Like this scary emotion will pass. It will. And that's something the mindfulness practice teaches all of us is the impermanence of things.
Mm.
How nothing is not this state that you're in right now is not permanent. And there's a lot of comfort in that. There's a lot of comfort in understanding that. And it can really help you work through some heavy stuff by just knowing, just having that little glimmer of hope, like this will pass. I know it will.
Yeah, and I would add to that, the other thing that like what we do at Elevate and what we teach people, like it's okay to have emotions. I think we live in a society and definitely in addiction, it masks our emotions. In fact, we're told and taught that having emotions is bad. Do you have depression and anxiety? You need to be medicated. When in reality, we can work through people with those and realize that these are normal human emotions and it's okay to have them. It doesn't mean we have to use because we're feeling a certain way, but we teach people how to recognize the emotion and not let them do it in, utilizing mindfulness. How do I get my skills? I'm really pissed about this. Okay, well, let me sit with that for a second before I go react or before I go take something because I'm feeling pissed and I shouldn't be pissed about this. It puts them in control of their emotions, but to also learn that emotions aren't bad. It is okay to have emotions. And just because you're experiencing some emotion doesn't mean you need to go utilize a substance in order to mask that. And I think that's a lot of what we work with people on is being able to be in an environment where you can be vulnerable, where you can have emotions and not need to use to mask them. And then how to work from them. I'm not saying you get a free pass to behave any way that you want, but to recognize that it is an emotion, it's not a bad thing, sit with it, experience it, feel it until it's no longer affecting you. And then we move on from it. And then what did we learn from that?
Yeah, and just understanding that, yeah, emotions are a part of life is huge, and just because you have a big emotion, maybe use that as a gauge that you need to change something about your life. There's a big change that you need to make, and what is it, right? What if it's depression, if it's anxiety, let's take a look at that. Let's give you some actions. There's things that we can all do to improve our state of being. And, I think that's a big part of what we do in treatment, life skills focused program, evidence-based as well. We utilize CBT, DBT, motivational interviewing, at Elevate Addiction Services. But something that's in other programs are utilizing this, but something truly unique that no one else is doing. So the 12-step program has some things that are really powerful, and they have, the fourth, fifth step that are like big life-changing processes that you go through with the sponsor. But the thing is, you go through them with the sponsor outside of treatment. And at Elevate, we actually go through those processes as a part of our 60-day program. And we just have a different kind of, we call them something different. We call them the responsibility step and the amends process. And, those are like very core uh, things that an individual needs to go through to really change. And so, it's essentially our alternative, and it's just the responsibility step is taking ownership of your actions. Maybe some of the things that you've done wrong, some of the mistakes that you've made, some of the lies that you made, really facing them, looking at them as they are. And the amends process is structured to repairing that damage that, some of those actions may have caused in your life, some of those relationships. So such a cool part of what we do, and something that I'm finding as I'm out in the field now as a client care navigator. It's truly a unique of ours.
Yeah, well, and you hit on it when you said responsibility, because when the individual can look at their past and their history and start to look at their part in things, because a lot of people come in, not my fault, this was done to me, this is why I'm this way. When we start peeling back the layers, and for a lot of people, they're like, oh, toxic statements, and then they go, oh my God, am I the toxic person? But as they start going through the responsibility step of the program and realizing that perhaps they had a part in creating this, in fact, they probably had a big part in creating it. And by the way, they weren't just hurting themselves. When they start to look at all the different areas in their lives, all the different people, all the different situations, and see them for what they are, and they take personal responsibility, that's what shifts them out of I'm a victim of this into they are causative over having created that. And now they can be causative over changing how they are going forward. So they're not a victim of a disease. They've created a heck of a past for themselves, but now they can overcome it and give themselves a new start.
Yeah, I love it. It's my personal favorite part of our program, Elevate. And the reason why it's my favorite part is I think it's that step that did the biggest change for me. And there's a certain uh desensitizing process as well, where you come to terms with your mistakes. A lot of us, we like to compartmentalize or forget or try to forget, and we're using to try to forget of our mistakes, we're using on top of it. But when you really face them, there's so much freedom in that. It's
Yeah.
like this weight lifted, and you share it with another person, and you're like, oh my gosh, now somebody else knows, and you just feel so amazing when you get through that. And then getting into the amends process of actually talking to someone, that you've harmed, and taking action towards trying to repair that in whatever way is like possible at that time. And that's what when we talk about empowerment in our program, like those things are truly empowering, going through those deep steps.
Yeah, I mean, because some of the hardest things you could do is to confront your family and take responsibility and ownership for the harmful actions that you've caused with them. And then when you say, how can I fix this with you so that when I leave here, how can I help rebuild our relationship together? The families are so grateful to be part of this process, to, first of all, not only have this person taking responsibility for all the stuff they've done, because up to this point, there was a lot of denial. I didn't do that. That wasn't me. That was you. That, I mean, addicts will gaslight people trying to help them. And so to, first of all, just to hear the acceptance of responsibility of having done those harmful things, but then saying, how can I make amends for this? How can I make up for the harm that I've done? So you're recognizing that you've done some bad things and you want to fix it. This is like you were saying, the best part of our program, where they're rebuilding that trust. They're saying, I did this, I want to make it better. I realize it was me. And it goes so far in the future relationships after they leave the program.
Yeah, 100%. I kind of want to shift gears to a different, like, what do you do if, like, when a program's a poor fit, right? Like, and talking about that a little bit, because a lot of people will go to treatment and the program's a poor fit. Um, and since we're talking about the non-12 step model versus the 12-step model, like maybe how an individual can kind of recognize that and maybe make some early changes so that they don't they're not just wasting their time. Essentially, they're going through this process of with a modality or a philosophy that just doesn't sit right with them. And so sometimes I can speak from experience. I went through a program in the early 2000s, and I just felt this deep resistance, right? I was very cynical, and I really refused to participate. And a lot of it had to do with, the philosophical clash, right? That, I wasn't in a place in my life where I could turn all this, this behavior over to a higher power, and believe that I was powerless. I just could not wrap my head around those ideas, and they just didn't sit right with me at that time, And so if you're experiencing like this deep resistance while in treatment with some of those ideas, I would recommend looking for, a non-12 step model. And another thing that could be a poor fit is, you're in treatment, you're learning tools, or you're talking about things, but you're not addressing the root causes. So you're in a program that's not trauma informed, right? Or they're not addressing, some of these other things that you're experiencing, right? And so we want, like, you could be mental health concerns like depression or anxiety. There's not tools to help you address those things. And so, if you're feeling like those things aren't being addressed in treatment, that's always another telltale sign to take a look for another program that is trauma informed, that is going to give you tools to help you deal with, whatever sort of other mental health conditions that you have. And another thing could be, there's a lot of times there's groups and there's not a lot of tools. There's not a lot of stuff you can actually put into use in your life. So, you could be talking about this or that, or maybe you're just dwelling on the past, just talking about stuff that you did, and it doesn't feel like you're going anywhere. So you want to make sure you're in a program where, you're actually getting tools that you can use in recovery. Tools that can help you manage cravings, emotional triggers. And there's also a level of actionable coping skills in the program. So just a couple things I wanted to bring up, yeah, regarding like if a program's not the right fit.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of times, and you touched on it, the talk therapy, just going over it round and round and round, you're not really healing anything. In fact, you're keeping it alive by just talking about it ad nauseum. So there's been a lot of science and done on disproving the efficacy of talk therapy. And I would say if you're an individual and you're debating whether this is a good program, I think a lot of people end up just succumbing to it, saying, it's me, it's not the program, because they don't realize there is alternatives out there. They don't realize that there's different ways to skin the cat, as they call it. There is other modalities because AANA has been around. It's funded by private equity. So it's put out there where it gives the appearance like it's this way or no way. And that's not always the case. So I know a lot of people stick with stuff, even though it doesn't resonate, just because they don't feel like there is any other options out there, which leads them thinking it must be them and not the program.
Yeah, Absolutely.
I want to bring up another one that we kind of touched on earlier, but I really think this is a big one for us, and it's co-occurring. So a lot of people, when we started Elevate, we immediately started doing an independent surveys of all of our clients and our graduates to see the efficacy of the program, to see how they were responding, and to see how they were doing long term. One of the main things that, so every client coming in fills out a big questionnaire, and then we check on it throughout the program. Number one thing that the majority, vast majority, 99% of the people coming into our program present with depression and anxiety. Those are, yeah, they're a buzzword, but everybody is depressed. They have anxiety about being in a group, getting off, drugs, off medications, new environment. Everybody comes in presenting with those. What we found is that as they go along through the program, and although we're not specifically addressing your depression, your anxiety, what we do know is by handling their addiction, doing the mindfulness, doing the group sessions together, confronting their wrongdoings, as they're going through the program and as they're handling the traumas and the responsibilities and all the different steps, they're working out, they're eating better, they're sleeping better. By the time they're leaving the program, the majority of them are under 10% even leaving with depression and anxiety as a co-occurring condition anymore. So that's why the majority of our people get off any medications or things that are specific for depression and anxiety, because what we've learned by doing the steps of the program, we are by proxy handling the depression and anxiety that was existing in the individual as an active addict.
Yeah. We have something truly amazing. It's true, and yeah, those I remember hearing about those statistics, and they are truly mind-blowing. Yeah, it just the whole package, the truly holistic. I've heard you say that a lot, right? The mind, body, spirit, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, responsibility, all and community, all those things really, really transform an individual and pull them out of this, terrible state that they are in when they come to us.
And why it's vital that we handle all those parts, because you can't just hyper focus on one area. Like, we're just going to handle the mental aspect if you're not handling the physical aspect, and they're still smoking a ton of cigarettes, eating bad food. Why do I feel like crap? Why would I ever get sober? Well, because you haven't handled the physical aspect. But then at the same time, you can't just say, we're just going to work out every day until you feel better and overcome your addiction, because we haven't handled the trauma that they need to handle. So there's all parts of it that need to be, and my expertise need to be handled with an individual, because addiction hits all of those. So we need to address and fix all those areas to truly send somebody back into the world as a whole and complete and healed individual. Another thing I want to add is that since we've been tracking the results of Elevate, so that's been for the last 10 years, I can confidently say that we have one of the highest success rates in the country as far as the individual completing the program, as well as being able to stay sober after they leave the program. And that's a really big differentiator, because I think the success rate of AA and NA is it's pretty low. And not to say that it's a bad thing. Certainly, I would much rather somebody be an NA or AA or any spinoff of that if it's helping them and they're able to work the program and they're able to get what they can get out of it.
Everyone's the driver of their own recovery, journey, and by choosing a non-12 step model, you're, selecting a path that's, built on science, self-responsibility, and holistic health. And it's a path that can really respect your personal philosophy and provide tangible skills needed and for lifelong sobriety. And so whether, you're seeking support through Smart Recovery or, looking for a comprehensive residential program like Elevate, know that it's an effective and it's also a very empowering future that awaits you. And so if you're struggling today, you guys can give us a call. You can go to elevaterehab.org and you'll speak with a professional today. So, please call us if you need help. You'll speak with somebody who's been doing this a really long time, and we're all very caring individuals and would love the opportunity to help you change your life.
Absolutely. We're all very passionate about what we do. You don't need to suffer alone.